Hi, today we're going to talk about Gregor Mendel and the concept of heredity or passing on genetic information. So, Mendel is known as the father of genetics. He was an Austrian monk and he essentially experimented with pea plants, which sounds simple, but at the same time, he was extremely meticulous, he was extremely observant, and he happened to pick a plant, well, because he was growing peas to eat. And in his observations, he was able to kind of see that pea plants had very, very observable traits. And we'll go over some of those, in a little bit. But really, in observing pea plants, he hit the lottery because pea plants worked for these genetic experiments that he was able to set up and plan out because he used essentially what are called purebred plants. So purebred plants have only have genes that are essentially like not mixed. They're only of one kind, and we'll kind of get into that vocabulary a little bit later. He set up very, very clear breeding conditions. And the traits that these pea plants had weren't mixed together. They were one or the other. So instead of, like, for example, if you have a tall plant and a short plant, Mendel did not observe any medium sized plants. The plants were either tall or they were short. And the good thing about these pea plants is they made a lot of babies in a quick amount of time, so he was able to get a lot of data. So, what did Mendel do? Well, he set up genetic crosses and controlled breeding. So, in that, he set up which plants were going to make babies with which other plants. And he identified these as generations. So the P generation is the first generation, the parent generation. The F1 is the second generation, so the kids. And then the F2 is the grandkids. And what he did was he looked at the anatomy of the flowers, because you may or may not know this. Flowers are for plants to make babies. I know that sounds kind of weird, but flowers are how they contain the parts so plants can make babies. So he took the male plants from the male parts from one plant, which is essentially like the pollen, and he took his little brush here, and he sprinkled that pollen onto the female plant, part of another plant. And he eliminated the possibility for the plants to self-pollinate. So what does that mean? Yes, plants can make babies with themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, these are plants, not other organisms. And they do that very commonly. Plants self-pollinate. So he was very observant and knew a lot about plants and how they made babies. And he had some very interesting observations here. So these are his parent plants. We can see that the one parent has purple flowers, the other parent has white. As we're following these genetic crosses, please be aware there's no light purple in here. There's no like mixing or like, white with purple dots. That's not happening. It's one or the other, purple or white. And he set up his crosses with purebred plants. So this plant only had the genes for purple, and this plant only had the genes for white flowers. And he set up these crosses and he looked at the babies, the F1 generation. All of these babies were purple, but they carried the gene for white flowers. Mendel didn't necessarily know that, but we know that now. He was able to draw that conclusion that something was happening and eventually concluded that they were carrying these genes, but he didn't know exactly what was happening right away. He then let these plants make babies together, And he noticed if you had 4 plants, 3 of the 4 on average had purple flowers. But that white flower reappeared in the F2 generation. And when he counted all of the purple flowers and all of the white flowers, he got a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every 3 purple, there was on average 1 white. And he observed this not just in flower color, pea shape. The pea plants could be round or wrinkled, the little peas inside the pea pods. They could be yellow or green. We went over purple and white flowers. The pod shape, the actual pea pod, had different shapes. The pod color could be green or yellow. The way the flowers were positioned. And then I always like this one, the tall versus short. And if you look at all these ratios, they are very, very close to a 3-to-1 ratio. And he counted, look at all these peas he counted, thousands of peas, colors and shapes, hundreds of pea pods and flowers. So this data is really good in that we want a lot of data. We don't just want to do an experiment once. He collected a lot of data and he kept very detailed records. And from his records, he was able to make some conclusions. He concluded that traits or characteristics were like how an organism looks or behaves or what have you. These traits are inherited, and they could be inherited in pieces or discrete units is what he called them. So during gamete formation, gametes are sex cells or egg and sperm, alleles. So this concept of an allele means different forms of a gene. So this or that, tall or short. So there are little discrete units that are called alleles. And these alleles can be passed on. And when gametes form, they can go into, kind of at random. But they separate in that one copy from mom and one copy from dad will go into an individual gamete. So here we represent, these are chromosomes. I know that's a little confusing. Say the purple copies from mom, the green copies from dad. On this purple chromosome, we have this little band here, and that band represents a gene for purple flowers. Here, on this chromosome, there is a little band that represents the gene for white flowers. And we call these versions, either purple or white, alleles. And when gametes form, this chromosome ends up in either an egg or a sperm, and then this chromosome ends up in an egg or a sperm. So the babies can inherit those genes for purple flowers or white flowers. They aren't stuck together. So eventually, when the egg and sperm come together, that restores the 2 copies and determines how that baby is going to look or what traits it has. So in conclusion here, this is an introduction to what Mendel researched. I love showing you his actual numbers. It's really, really cool. And we're going to be building upon some of these vocab terms like dominant and recessive. We're going to be building upon that with your vocabulary cards. So make sure you're completing your vocabulary. You know what all those words mean. And that's really, really going to help as we move on and we actually get to do Punnett squares and make some predictions of our own. Thank you.